甜对你来说可能有点太甜。
Any good? Any good? No, I had more fun with this.
Just throw it over your shoulder.
Well, hers might be sweeter than you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's
chocolate.
Has the.
You get
He is. Yeah. I've ever seen some kids don't like.
Oh, it's on here.
So this one.
You know, I have a very.
I kind of like.
And the Zoom link is not shared with anyone. No one else.
No, yeah.
Join this. Like.
I already have to like. In the low.
Yeah, you can, basically this corner.
Oh, it's already like.
Yeah.
Well.
Give me a one.
Yeah, it should be good. If you're on that side of.
I think they tend.
I lied. And you're on this side of the screen, you're. I mean, we can sort that out.
This.
Yeah, so you're, that's kind of your.
At least there worries.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I love it, but like, I don't want to.
Ready for this?
Waving at people. You know.
Chemistry center also will have them.
I was curious.
Oh.
I was like, those kind of sport ships are like, actually fine. Oh, it's just called that.
Very cheap.
Oh, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, we should connect.
You gotta be-
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Like that?
Yeah, like,
Yeah. Oh, that's so It's really upsetting. At that point.
Yeah.
I know, a lot of people's going to say.
Yeah, it's right, exactly. Yeah, we're actually gonna make that, like I said.
I think it's like.
It's kind of fun to.
I feel like you have.
Which one could we go there?
No, it should be bad. Yeah, that's not something.
他跟我说，他那个螺肉闻起来很香。
I'm also having it.
That's right, it's right. Whenever you're ready. I'll let about the time.
Except you're like. Which is.
Yeah, but that. We have to just get used to it. Yeah, that's good.
Find my door.
Hey.
Roger.
Hello, everybody. I have a All right, thanks so much for joining this seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Reinhard, and also Associate Professor of Biogeochemistry, and also Dr. Pear Power Chair in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Science at Georgia Tech. Dr. Reinhardt's research explores the complex interplay between greenhouse gases and planetary system, and also carbon management. Dr. Reinhardt has also received prestigious honors, including the Alfred Sloan Fellowship in Ocean Science, the Sigma Chi Young Faculty Awards, and James Massillon Medals from the AGU. All right, and we're going to hear from Dr. Reinhardt about ocean-based biosignatures on exoplanet world today. All right, take it away.
Thanks. Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to present to y'all. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Happy Halloween. I'm sorry I'm not in a costume. I have PTSD from showing up to give a talk as the only person in a costume. I thought everyone happened. And I was the only one. There were people in suits. And I just never gotten over it.
My mask covers my eyes, otherwise I can't see this.
There you go. All right. So yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about today is a particular type of biosignature on a particular flavor of exoplanet. And I'm going to sort of try to make the case that there are some links between the way oxygen works and the way phosphorus works on Earth that can inform the way that these things might behave on other habitable worlds. But I'm also going to sort of step lightly in the sense that, you know, sort of one approaches this with an attitude of humility, because there's a lot to learn, even about how the Earth works, let alone other planets that we're analyzing remotely. So just to start out, I want to thank the folks that I've worked with on this. A whole slew of collaborators from a bunch of different institutions at one point or another have kind of contributed to the work here. They're not responsible for anything silly or stupid that I say, but anything that's cool is probably them, not me. This has been funded largely through NASA, through their research coordination network on exoplanet system science, and in particular through a sort of large multi-institution effort that's led out of University of California, Riverside, which is where I did my PhD. All right, so some of you I've not met, some of you I have. I wanted to start by just kind of giving you a little bit of a sense of kind of where we're calling from, sort of what we do in the lab, what I do and kind of think about. And trying to make the case that there's a thread that kind of runs through all of it. So a lot of what we do is sort of tool development in a way. So we develop modeling tools and also sort of empirical geochemical proxy tools to try and understand how geochemical cycles work on planets in the broadest sense. And you know, you can do a number of things with this. Actually, a lot of what we have done in recent years is understanding the sort of geochemistry of humans in the Earth system, and in particular, the biogeochemistry of greenhouse gases in sort of managed human systems like agriculture, wastewater treatment, forestry, coastal ecosystem restoration, that kind of thing. But we've used a lot of the same or very similar tools to look at how the Earth has evolved over time in the sort of broadest sense. So the Earth has been a planet. There's a tendency to sort of separate Earth science from planetary science. I think the Earth is a planet. It's one of my favorites. And you know, it's been evolving as a rocky world with a hydrosphere and an atmosphere for 4.5 billion years. And you know, we think it has a lot to tell you about how planets work. It's obviously idiosyncratic in any number of ways, but it also you know, can provide insight into how basic geochemical cycles and metabolic ecosystems are coupled, how these cycles interact with climates, and how all of these kind of coupled systems can sort of evolve over time. So we spend a lot of time using very similar modeling and proxy tools to sort of track the evolution of the Earth system over time, and in particular to kind of link empirical constraints on what the Earth system looks like from the rock record with sort of thoughts about how the Earth system might have looked to a remote observer. Okay, and that's sort of where this talk comes in. So if you take one more step back in the aperture, we're very interested in the sort of general characteristics that regulate the sort of emergence and maintenance of biosignatures on habitable worlds. So if you're looking at a transit spectrum or a direct imaging spectrum of a planetary atmosphere, for instance, what are some signatures in that atmosphere might tell you something about whether or not there's life at the surface is something that we're very interested in. And because the Earth has been inhabited for billions of years, and we have some empirical constraints on what the Earth's atmospheric composition has been, we sort of use it as a test bed for the evolution of atmospheric biosignatures. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is really sort of an exception to that, because of course the Earth is just one type of planet, and one of the things that we've been getting our heads around in recent years in particular is just how diverse rocky worlds are and can be. And so one doesn't want to have sort of Earth-centric blinders necessarily, but we'd still argue that there's a lot to learn from the Earth that's relevant here. I'm going to try and make that case to a certain extent today. All right, so exoplanets. This is probably not a crowd where I need to introduce the concept of exoplanets. I suspect most people are familiar with this. But I like to usually start by pointing out the sort of oldest record that I know of the sort of presumption that there are planets outside the solar system. If you know of something earlier than this, please tell me. I'm always on the lookout for there very well may be. This is the oldest I've been able to find. So this is a statement by Giordano Bruno. Many of you will probably be familiar with him and his life and history. But I think this is a really fantastic quote. This is back in 1584, and he said, "In space there are countless constellations, suns, and planets. We see only the suns because they give light. The planets remain invisible, for they are small and dark," which for anyone who sort of tries to do remote planet characterization is kind of like, that's sort of captures it all in some ways, right? And he also said there are also numberless Earths circling around their suns. Okay, so it's quite a long time ago. This is someone who was saying, surely there are worlds beyond measure out there. But it's because of this this statement sort of took for granted, but because of this statement, they're really hard to see, right? And so in 1584, maybe earlier, people are suggesting that there are going to be planets outside the solar system. It wouldn't be until the mid-90s that we would actually be able to see these and confirm that they existed, okay? And since then, in the last few decades, I think people will definitely be familiar with this sort of explosion in the sort of abundance of confirmed exoplanets through a whole wide range of sort of detection methods here. And there's obviously a lot going on here. There's sort of sampling bias associated with large planets that are close to their stars and so on and so forth. But I think we just passed the 6,000 mark of confirmed exoplanets. And this is, from the time that, Pearl Jam released their first album, we went from 0 to 6,000 exoplanets, which is pretty incredible. And this is just going to keep, going up. And as we detect more and more of these, we're detecting more and more sort of Earth-like planets. And we're getting better and better at characterizing them beyond just detecting them, actually characterizing some of their features. So this is just a really exciting time to be working in exoplanets and really in planetary science more broadly, because everything that I would say about the Earth, I would also say about Mars and the planets in our solar system. Like, all of these planets tell us something about how life operates or doesn't on a planetary surface, and the remotely detectable signatures that you would expect a given combination of planet and biosphere or lack thereof to sort of manifest. So obviously a lot of interest in sort of building up the infrastructure to kind of characterize these planets at higher and higher frequency and in more detail in the 2020s, 2030s. There's sort of a lot here that's not super important for us, except to say that this is a really exciting time to be thinking about this, because the way that it's sometimes put by people who are sort of more better at this than I am is that we're sort of moving from the era of exoplanet detection to the era of exoplanet characterization, and we're going to start to learn more and more rich details about how these planets actually operate. So one of the things that we would argue is that we and others, that this sort of places a really high premium on understanding the sort of diversity of potentially habitable worlds, and really kind of thinking a little bit outside the box. I know everything I said about Earth, sure, but what's the sort of range of different styles of habitable world that we can kind of conjure, and what are the dynamics that control biosignatures on them? How stable are those biosignatures over time? And are there sort of remote constraints that can be placed on the things that control those biosignatures? That's sort of the motivation here. So what I'm going to try and get through is a few things. So I'm going to start by trying to convince you that oxygen and its associated impacts on the chemistry of planetary atmospheres are really key for remote life detection. Not a magic bullet, all sorts of problems, not the only game in town, but an important one. I'm going to try and make that case. This might be familiar to some of you, maybe not to others, so I'm going to start at the sort of brass tacks and try and convince you that this is something that you should be interested in. Then I'm going to try and convince you that if you're interested in oxygen, you need to be interested in phosphorus. Okay. And illustrate in a kind of passing way, and I will try to resist the urge to drill too deeply into it, the links between phosphorus and oxygen cycling on Earth, but the mechanics that we think are probably relevant for rocky planets in general. So this is going to involve talking a little bit about Earth's phosphorus cycle, but not belaboring it, and in particular emphasizing the role of hydrothermal systems in the Earth's phosphorus cycle, because the sort of core of what I want to try and get through is what's going on these planets that are referred to as water worlds or ocean worlds. So this, just to be explicit, this is a planet that has none of its crust exposed above sea level. That's what I mean when I say water world. Okay? And you know, this is, I don't mean the Kevin Costner movie, although it's a classic. You should probably check it out if you haven't watched it. One of Dennis Hopper's best roles. But I'm going to try and make the case that this is a very different phosphorus cycle than the Earth's current phosphorus cycle. Okay. And I'm going to sort of raise the specter that these sorts of planets might actually be biological deserts. Even if they have life on them, they might not be able to support the sort of large, robust biosphere that you would need to get a remotely detectable atmospheric biosignature. Then I'm going to make the case that this is actually, this is the sort of null hypothesis, but may not be right, because we've sort of done some experiments I'm going to present that suggest that seafloor weathering in a completely water-covered surface can be a fairly large source of bioavailable phosphorus, which can support oxygen production. And then when things probably will really go off the rails and people will be starting to nod off, I'm going to try and introduce a sort of nutrient-oxygen feedback system that is probably unique to water worlds relative to the Earth, that involves ventilation of the ocean and the support of nutrient fluxes from seafloor hydrothermal systems. Okay, so why oxygen? So part of this is the Earth. So again, you know, the Earth is not the only way that a planet can do life and remote detectability, but it's our best known example and most sort of detailed example of a planet that has life and that you might be able to characterize remotely. And one of the key features of the Earth, of course, is that its atmosphere is about 20% oxygen. This is really strange. Okay, we take it for granted, and of course, you know, if there's even just a little bit less than this, all of us would be passing out. I mean, we're just chugging oxygen all the time, and the kind of complex life that we're surrounded by all the time requires a really large amount of oxygen. But this is a pretty bizarre state of affairs. 20% by mass of the Earth's atmosphere is oxygen. It's weird even for the Earth, actually. For most of Earth's history, this has not been the case. Okay, and the overwhelming, I mean, I want to CO2 photolysis and stuff, but the overwhelming majority of this oxygen is coming from life. This is being sourced by photosynthesis in the Earth's biosphere. So 20% of the Earth's atmosphere by mass is derived entirely from life, okay, which is a really remarkable thing. And you know, the idea of using either oxygen itself or other sort of remotely detectable signatures associated with the presence of oxygen to indicate life goes back a pretty long way. It really sort of goes back to the 70s, actually, but this is, I think, a particularly cool example that was published by Sagan and colleagues in 1993 using when the Galileo spacecraft was doing a flyby of the Earth. They analyzed some features of the Earth using Galileo. So, short of hands, how many people have seen this paper, read this paper? Okay, you really should. It's a great thought experiment because it basically takes the standpoint that we're going to look at the Earth as a sort of neutral observer and ask ourselves, what can Galileo tell us about life on Earth or not? And so, you know, they looked at the sort of the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere. They looked at sort of the spectral impacts of pigments at the surface. And this is the abstract. And so they highlighted a few sort of signals, again, sort of taking the attitude that we don't know anything about this planet. We're just going to use Galileo to observe it. And we're going to ask, what does this tell us? And the main things that they said, well, all right, we see evidence of abundant gaseous oxygen in the form of both O2 and ozone, O3. We see atmospheric methane in extreme thermodynamic disequilibrium. And we see radio transmission, which they go so far as to say it seems uniquely attributable to intelligence, which is maybe a little bit above my pay grade, but pretty bold statement. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that all of these are connected to the fact that Earth has oxygen in its atmosphere, right? So oxygen, obviously, but atmospheric methane in extreme thermodynamic disequilibrium, you can ask disequilibrium with respect to what, right? And this extreme thermodynamic disequilibrium exists because there's a bunch of oxygen and a bunch of methane. So this is also directly tied to the abundance of oxygen in the atmosphere. And depending on what you think about the need for aerobic respiration to build biological complexity, you could argue even this is connected to having a certain amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Okay, so this is a great example, but there's a huge literature on the notion of using oxygen in planetary atmospheres as a signal for life. And this all sort of grows out of the reality of the situation on Earth. This is a non-exhaustive sort of smattering of papers. Some recent work has kind of tried to broaden the aperture a little bit beyond just oxygen to just look at thermodynamic disequilibrium sort of more broadly. What are some other pairs of sort of disequilibrium remotely detectable gases that you could support? But a lot of these ultimately sort of end up collapsing back to some disequilibrium between oxygen and some other species. Now, I should say there's a whole separate corner of the literature that's sort of been expanding over recent years on oxygen false positives, if you like. So there are ways of getting significant amounts of oxygen in a planetary atmosphere that don't require life. I'm going to put a pin in that for now. I'm happy to talk about it for anyone who's interested. And this is an important area of work we dabble in a little bit because one wants to be able to either rule these out or diagnose them observationally. And it turns out that there are some ways to do that. But suffice it to say that if we detect significant oxygen or ozone in the atmosphere of an exoplanet, it's going to be a big deal, and it may end up being, upon further characterization, a false positive. But people are going to lose it, and in part because this is such an important biosignature for the Earth system. Okay, so that's why oxygen. The other thing to add, although I'm a biogeochemist rather than a spectroscopher or a photochemist, but oxygen is also very spectrally active. So for people who are sort of doing remote detection, both O2 and ozone, we'll get into this a little bit later, have some pretty distinct signatures that tend to stand out relative to other sort of very broadly common atmospheric constituents. Okay, so oxygen is also sort of useful in a practical way, although I tend to over-index on its biogeochemistry. All right, so oxygen's good. It's largely sourced by life, spectrally active. But there's another step here that I want to try and convince you of, which is that the story of oxygen is really a story of bioavailable phosphorus. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So the first thing is just to note that phosphorus appears to be essential for life as we know it. I think there might be some prebiotic chemists who are sort of thinking, wait, this is doing a lot of lifting, and that's fine. I mean, I think we should definitely, we should entertain sort of alternative chemistries and think about what their implications are for remote detection. But I think it also does make sense to start with as we know it, because we know it. We know a lot about it. And so, it's not like, this is the only way that life can do life, but it's a way that life does life that we know pretty well. And so it seems like a reasonable place as any to start. So phosphorus is sort of generally essential for the biochemistry that we sort of recognize as life, but it's also really significant on the largest possible planetary scales, at least on Earth, okay? And to understand this, we just need to have a sense for sort of what the biosphere does, the photosynthetic biosphere does. So I'm sort of focusing on the ocean here, but a lot of this reasoning could be ported into terrestrial ecosystems. And many of you will probably be familiar with this. What the photosynthetic biosphere is doing most of the time is, taking CO2, it's using energy from the sun to strip electrons off of water, put them on carbon, and make biomass, okay? This is what photosynthesis does. And in the process of oxidizing water, it creates oxygen as a byproduct. It doesn't want to do this. In fact, it's kind of a pain, as far as I can tell. But it's just sort of, this is what happens. If you use water as an electron donor, you're gonna make some oxygen. There's a reverse reaction, of course, that sort of recombines these constituents and remineralizes everything back into inorganic carbon and nutrients, okay? And just as this photosynthetic step required an input of energy to execute, this respiration step releases energy. And so the organisms that are taking this organic matter, stripping electrons off of it and adding them to oxygen are generating a significant amount of energy. So for a lot of the carbon and oxygen cycle, this is just kind of going around and around. You go into the surface ocean, this is largely zero sum. You have a huge amount of photosynthesis and a huge amount of respiration, all right? But there's a little bit of a leak of this carbon. So some of this carbon, this organic carbon that used to be CO2 is gonna settle into the ocean interior. Some of it's gonna be respired in the ocean interior. Some of it's gonna make it all the way to sediments. Now we're talking, less than 1% of the sort of gross amount of carbon that's fixed photosynthetically is gonna make it into sediments. But once it makes it down here, and once it makes it through the upper 20 centimeters or so in a continental margin, it's pretty stable. A lot of this carbon is gonna essentially go into the lithosphere, and it's gonna be recycled on only very, very long timescales, okay? And every mole of carbon that does this releases a mole of oxygen into the surface system that's got nowhere to go, all right? So this is why the Earth's atmosphere is 20% oxygen right now, is that there's a certain amount of carbon, even it seems like a pretty small leak, but it's the basis of all of our lives, is being buried into the lithosphere and releasing oxygen to the surface. And this oxygen can then accumulate in the atmosphere. So every molecule of oxygen that you chug as you're sitting out there breathing corresponds to some mole of carbon somewhere in the Earth's crust. It used to be biomass in the ocean or in a terrestrial system. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at this in a little bit more detail, you can see, all right, well, there are a couple of other ingredients here. There's not just carbon, you also need nutrients. And you can see that I've added these coefficients here for each of these things, except the only ingredient that doesn't have a coefficient is phosphorus, right? So this is implying to you immediately that this is going to be the limiting reactant for this process, right? So phosphorus is, on the global scale, is taken to be what's sort of often referred to as the ultimate limiting nutrient for globally integrated rates of photosynthesis. And there's a set of kind of thermostatic mechanisms in the ocean and on land that kind of link the cycling of nitrogen to the cycling of phosphorus in a way that ultimately allows phosphorus to kind of drive the aggregate amount of photosynthesis that's happening. There are exceptions to this from place to place. There are regions in the ocean where this sort of breaks down. There are terrestrial ecosystems where this sort of breaks down. But in the ocean in particular, globally, this is a remarkably consistent relationship. And if you go out to most regions of the ocean, you can win money all day betting what the ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus is in that water sample. Okay? And the reason for that is because the biosphere is thermostatically regulating photosynthetic production to the availability of phosphorus in the ocean. There are regions where there are exceptions to this, but I can tell you where those are, and I can predict for very clear reasons why there are exceptions to this. And so what this means is that in the long run, this rate of oxygen production through this process is most fundamentally constrained by the phosphorus inventory of the ocean, okay? And if I take a model and I sort of perturb the phosphorus inventory of the ocean and I let this ripple through the biosphere, I'm going to see changes in nitrate, changes in organic matter burial, and changes in oxygen flux that are going to scale very coherently. So phosphorus go up, phosphorus go down, oxygen go down to a first approximation. All right, so what does the phosphorus cycle do? So again, I'm going to assume that this is something that you don't spend tons of time thinking about for reasons that are very, very understandable. One wonders why I do. So this is a sort of general depiction of the Earth's phosphorus cycle, and it leaves a few things out that I think are important and I'm going to get to, but I can't resist the opportunity to show the snail from this. So generally, what's sort of the kind of modern phosphorus cycle is thought to involve primarily the weathering of phosphorus from crustal rocks and the solubilization of this phosphorus and its sort of transport through terrestrial ecosystems in which it can be sort of recycled through uptake into plants and then through detritivores recycled back into the system. There's a little bit of a leak in rivers and streams out into the ocean. Then it gets into the ocean, it does kind of the same thing. It goes round and round the biosphere. Some of it leaks out into organic matter. Some of it gets recycled back into the system. And then this little, in a manner that's very similar to the sort of carbon that's leading to oxygen release, this little leak of phosphorus that goes into the lithosphere is eventually sort of recycled back to the surface. Bada boom, bada bing, you got yourself a phosphorus cycle. And so, but the key thing here is that, this works for the modern Earth and is great for a planet that has 30% of its continental crust above sea level, or 30% of its crust above sea level. And is actively recycling it tectonically so that you're breaking it up and you're solubilizing the phosphorus in this crust and delivering it into the system. But if this is your take on what a phosphorus cycle can look like, then a water world for you is basically like a non-starter from a biosignature perspective to begin with, because you can't get phosphorus into the system. You have nothing to weather to start out with. But there's one flux in the phosphorus cycle that's often very much neglected in this figure, but I'm not cherry picking. This is, Google image the phosphorus cycle, and you will have a hard time finding a figure that includes this additional process, which is hydrothermal systems. Okay, so hydrothermal systems are really important for phosphorus on Earth. And it's not even one of these things where it's like boutique on the Earth, but I'm going to tell you it's important for water worlds. It's like important on Earth even now. So these sorts of figures, it's like, this is fine. But this is like maybe 70% of the business, okay? So what do I mean by hydrothermal systems? So all of you will sort of be familiar with this, presumably. So in these divergent margins, you have really strong heat flow, and the closer you get to these margins, the larger the geothermal heat flux gets, and it kind of tapers, pretty rapidly as you move away from these margins. And if you look at this sort of in cross section, this is the kind of thing you see. So this is the sort of axis of one of these ridges here. And the further you get out from this axis, the less heat you're sort of dissipating through seawater flowing through the crust. But in some of these really distant areas, you have sort of low temperature dissolution of oceanic crust in the presence of seawater at, at relatively low temperatures. So 25, 30 degrees, something like this. So it's not super hot. This is where these are the sort of charismatic hydrothermal systems, but actually a huge fraction of the heat flow that's ultimately sort of percolating through the Earth's ocean crust is happening at these lower temperatures. It's just because the temperature is lower, so you need to move much more water through the system to dissipate the same amount of heat. So the water fluxes through these systems are really, really massive, and even small sort of concentration anomalies that can emerge when you're dissolving ocean crust in the presence of these percolating fluids, when they come back into seawater, can actually generate huge fluxes because the amount of water you're pushing through these systems is really large. So it turns out that these are systems that are potentially releasing a lot of phosphorus through the dissolution of ocean crust. And this has nothing to do with the sort of weathering of continents above sea level. The problem here is they also release a lot of iron. So when this iron gets into the Earth's ocean, which is ventilated with oxygen more or less throughout, this iron oxidizes to iron oxides, and these iron oxides scavenge phosphorus and remove it from the system. So actually on Earth, this is a sink of phosphorus, okay? So this is a removal flux of something like 25 to 30% of the phosphorus that's moving through the Earth system at any given time. All right. So taking a step back, what might all of this mean for a planet like this that has no crust above sea level, and for which the geochemistry of nutrient cycling is really about what's happening at the seafloor? Okay. So I started to sort of maybe lean in the direction that maybe this is not such a big deal because you've got these seafloor hydrothermal systems that can release a bunch of phosphorus. But on Earth, those systems are actually only making the situation worse. They're actually a sink of phosphorus. They're removing phosphorus that's coming from the weathering of stuff above sea level. And so this has led to a sort of assumption about these planets that they're, it's not that they're not habitable. They might be great places for life, but they might be biological deserts because there's just not enough nutrient to support the kind of biosphere you would need to sort of reshape atmospheric chemistry the way the Earth's biosphere has. Okay? And this is a reasonable null hypothesis because, at least on Earth, the only possible source of phosphorus to these systems is going to be seafloor hydrothermal processes, but on Earth, those are a sink. So where are you going to get phosphorus on these planets? And I should say, sort of, zooming out one more step, that these are important planets to think about because they appear to be very common. So this type of planet is a significant fraction, at least so far, of the sort of Earth-like planets that are being detected. And I think, at least to my mind, more importantly, distinguishing remotely between a planet that looks like this and a planet that looks like the Earth is actually really hard because it doesn't take a ton of extra water to submerge all of the Earth's continents. So we're going to run into these. And the question of whether or not they're good targets for follow-up characterization is an important one. I'm going to argue that they are. Okay. So one of the ways that we decided to kind of look at this was, let's just see what how basalt dissolution sort of operates under different conditions. So we took some basalt from Juan de Fuca that was sampled by a submersible, and we put it under anoxic conditions, and we monitored how it dissolved. So the idea here is, on the modern Earth, the removal of phosphorus in hydrothermal systems kind of relies on this fact that the Earth's oceans are very well oxygenated. Well, what if there isn't a lot of oxygen in the ocean? Does that change the picture? So to do this, we took basalt and we measured the silicon isotope composition of an experimental system. So we took basalt that has a sort of natural abundance ratio between silicon 28 and 29. We stuck it in modified seawater, which we spiked with a huge amount of silicon 29, with the idea that as this basalt dissolves, it's going to release dissolved silica into the system at the natural abundance ratio that's going to start to titrate out this spike excess. And what we would expect is over time, we would see the ratio drop towards the natural abundance ratio if basalt was dissolving and silicon was being released, okay? So this is the way we're going to track basalt dissolution. And the way we're going to quantify the rates of basalt dissolution, right, through isotope mass balance. So indeed, this is what we see. So this is just sort of an example of from a whole slew of experiments. So this is the silicon isotope ratio on the left here. And you can see over time, it evolves very systematically towards the natural abundance ratio. It doesn't quite get there. We think we're getting sort of secondary phase formations that's sort of quenching the dissolution before you can get all the way down to the natural abundance ratio. But we can use this to quantify the amount of silicon that's being released by the basalt and estimate the amount of basalt that's being dissolved, okay? So this doesn't tell you anything about phosphorus yet. It's just sort of telling you, basalt is dissolving, which is great. I mean, of course it is kind of on some level. It's like, did you really need a mass spec and an isotope spike to show that? And the answer is sort of no, but getting the rates, as we'll see, is actually quite useful for us. So we can look at phosphorus and iron in the system too, and what we see is something pretty interesting. So if you do this dissolution under anoxic conditions, what you essentially get is largely congruent release of iron and phosphorus during the reaction. So the reaction progress is sort of moving from left to right here. So as this silicon isotope ingrowth shows basalt dissolving in the system, we're getting phosphorus released and iron released, and you can this line here is that this isn't a regression. This is mid-ocean ridge basalt stoichiometry. Okay, so this is sort of what you would expect if you took this basalt and you just dissolved it and released phosphorus and iron more or less stoichiometrically into the system. This is also not shocking because it's an anoxic system, and so in contrast to modern seafloor hydrothermal systems, you can't oxidize this iron. Okay, so this is something that we might expect, but what it tells us is that if the system's anoxic, you can actually release some phosphorus through this seafloor basalt alteration. So we can take this a step further and assume a sort of simple sort of CO2 uptake based on mineralogy for the basalt. And we can ask, for a given set of experiments, what is the amount of CO2 that is consumed during basalt dissolution relative to the amount of phosphorus that's released? And this is a similar plot showing the reaction progress from left to right here. And we can get a ratio between phosphorus release and CO2 consumption. Okay? So this is useful for us because this is the thing that sort of governs the amount of phosphorus that's released from weathering on land on Earth. And so we can actually compare this ratio directly to what you see in modern rivers on Earth and ask, is this a lot? Is it a little? How much phosphorus are we really talking about here? And this is what you get when you do that comparison. So this is kind of really what's most important for our purposes here. So this range shows for modern riverine systems on Earth the ratio between CO2 removed by weathering and phosphorus released. Okay, and this is the ratio that we see in our experiments. So the implication here is that as long as the ocean is anoxic, then seafloor basalt dissolution should basically give you just as much bang for your buck as the weathering of continents on land, which is to say, you know, the majority of the phosphorus flux to the modern Earth's biosphere, right? So if the ocean's anoxic, this can actually flip from being, you know, a 30% sink to a massive source of phosphorus, okay? Okay. I'm gonna skip this. This is kind of wordy and stupid. If you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to go into later. All right, so, but this introduces kind of a problem, okay? So this is a negative feedback that might actually sort of make all this kind of fall apart, all right? So if we start with the ocean phosphorus inventory, okay? The ocean phosphorus inventory, for reasons I've described, is going to control the amount of organic carbon that's buried. The amount of organic carbon that's buried is going to control release and accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere. And that's going to control the amount of oxygen in the ocean, right? Because the ocean and atmosphere, they're not obviously in perfect equilibrium, but they're exchanging with one another. A lot of the ocean surface is more or less in gas exchange equilibrium with the overlying atmosphere. And this ocean oxygen level is going to feed back into this anoxic weathering. Okay, so if you imagine a water world that's anoxic, is this really stable? Can this work? Right? Because if I increase ocean phosphorus, I'm going to increase carbon burial. All these solid arrows are positive impacts, and the dotted arrows are negative impacts. I'm going to increase carbon burial. I'm going to increase atmospheric O2. I'm going to ventilate the ocean. If I do too much of this, I'm going to shut off this source of phosphorus. Because if I ventilate the whole ocean, then these hydrothermal systems are just going to act the way they act on the modern Earth. All right, you're going to oxidize iron. It's going to scavenge phosphorus, and now you've turned what could be a really large source into a sink. So the question that's interesting to us is it possible to maintain this anoxic source of phosphorus, but also have atmospheric O2 levels that you might be able to remotely detect? Because if atmospheric O2 gets too high, you're going to shut this off. And everything's going to fall apart. You're going to end up with your biological desert. Or maybe it'll oscillate back and forth between high and low O2. And so the question is there a stable atmospheric O2 that we could detect that's you know, essentially high enough to detect, but low enough to allow this to go on so that the biosphere can remain stable over time? So the way that we've been sort of looking at this is with a sort of simple idealized ocean biogeochemistry model. So this is a 3D ocean biogeochemistry model with a 2D atmosphere and a very simple climate model. We set it up as a water world, so we've got no continents, and we have a more or less boring topography of about 3.5 kilometers. This is just sort of an example simulation. We're doing a bunch of these under a bunch of different configurations. Happy to sort of chat about that at this point. But this is sort of where we start. So we take this this water world that has a sort of vaguely Proterozoic Earth climate, and we're going to just run a bunch of simulations here, and we're going to vary independently the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere and track how much oxygen ends up in the ocean, and the amount of nutrient in the ocean. So we can vary these independently. This is one of the useful, the things about this model that's quite useful is that it's relatively low resolution, so it's very fast. We can run thousands and thousands of these for very, very long time scales. So we can assess long-term stability. We can do massive ensembles where we have unconstrained parameters that we can vary. What I'm going to focus on for our purposes is just this sort of subset of simulations here. So what I'm showing here are sort of zonally averaged cross sections of dissolved oxygen in the ocean as a function of depth. Okay, so I've got latitude from south to north on the x-axis here, and then depth on the y-axis here. So these are just slices zonally averaged through the ocean. And each of these is showing the amount of dissolved oxygen in micromoles per kilogram. And so moving from left to right here, I'm increasing atmospheric oxygen. So I'm fixing the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere at a certain value, essentially from low to high. And you can even kind of see this if you look at the scales here. They're changing by about an order of magnitude from left to right. That tells you immediately that I'm changing atmospheric oxygen quite a lot. This is like getting close to sort of modern Earth conditions, if you like. And then what I'm going to do from top to bottom here is I'm going to increase the amount of nutrients in the ocean. And the reason I'm doing this is because something I haven't talked about is that in addition to this sort of large scale link between the total amount of phosphorus and the total amount of oxygen released, there's also a way in which the distribution of phosphorus in the ocean controls the distribution of oxygen, okay? So if you have all other things being equal, if you have more nutrient in the ocean at a given atmospheric oxygen level, you're going to have more anoxia, because more nutrient means more photosynthesis, more food for aerobic respiration in the ocean interior, and less oxygen. So you can see this example right here. So this is an example where I've got something like an order of magnitude less oxygen in the atmosphere than the modern Earth. And all three of these have the same amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. What's different is this is a high nutrient case, and this is a low nutrient case. So in a low nutrient case, the system is, oligotrophic, if you like. There's a lot less respiration in the ocean. A given amount of oxygen goes deeper into the ocean interior. For the same amount of oxygen, if I increase phosphorus, I can get quite a bit of anoxia in the ocean interior. And you can see that these kind of compensate for one another to a certain extent. If I can decrease oxygen, but also decrease nutrients and get quite a bit of ventilation, even at relatively low atmospheric oxygen. So there's a lot going on here and some interesting sort of nuance, but the point is just to ask, if we do a bunch of these and we ask, all right, well, what are the combinations of atmospheric oxygen and ocean nutrient level that allow for the deep ocean where hydrothermal alteration would be happening to be anoxic, right? Because again, eyes on the prize, we need to get this phosphorus source to work, we need an anoxic deep ocean, okay? Once we lose that, this phosphorus source shuts down and the water world will become biologically fairly boring. So we can sweep out a pretty wide parameter range on these. So this is an example where I just did a large sort of 2D ensemble. So these are both log scale. So on the x-axis here is atmospheric oxygen. So this is the value of atmospheric oxygen that I'm fixing the model at. And this is in just ridiculous units that are just a term of art. I'm sorry to do this to you, but this is just how it's done. This is present atmospheric level rather than like atmospheres or bars for serious folks. This is how we do it in the Earth history world. And on the y-axis here is the oceanic phosphorus level, and this is similarly the present oceanic level. All right, so these are all kind of scaled to the modern Earth, and I'm sweeping out sort of four orders of magnitude or so in atmospheric oxygen and a couple orders of magnitude in phosphorus. And then what I'm sort of mapping here is the dissolved oxygen level at depth within the ocean. Okay, because this is going to be sort of our metric for whether or not we would expect the ocean to be anoxic at depth, all right? And so what I need in order to get this seafloor hydrothermal phosphorus source to work is oxygen that's below around 1 micromole per kilogram or so. If I get too far above that, I'm going to oxygenate the iron that comes out, and this is just going to shut off, okay? So in order for this to work, I need to be sort of somewhere out in this dark region here, where the amount of oxygen in the deep ocean is really, really low, right? And so the question that, again, to sort of restate it is, all right, I'm one step closer here because now I know the range of atmospheric oxygen, at least in this modeled water world, that allows me to maintain a phosphorus cycle. But the question is, would I ever be able to detect that level of oxygen remotely? Because if not, then it doesn't really do me any good that I have a phosphorus cycle. I'm sort of, back to the biological desert problem. The other thing you can see is that the response of the system is really, really strong to atmospheric oxygen and is a little bit less responsive to the amount of phosphorus in the ocean. And so the key thing here is going to be how much oxygen is in the atmosphere. So what we're kind of doing now, and I'm going to I'll show some sort of preliminary results on this, is trying to quantify, well, all right, how low is too low to see? And can we get detectable oxygen signals in the atmosphere at relatively low oxygen that would allow the biosphere to stay fed by seafloor phosphorus? And the way that we do that, I say we, this is kind of above my pay grade. I work with a very clever photochemist and instrument simulator named Eddie Schwederman at UC Riverside. And this is just one example of a set of calculations where he's basically said, all right, I'm going to take a direct imaging spectrum. So I'm going to assume that I have an exoplanet that has light from the stars bouncing off of the atmosphere, and then we're seeing that reflected light. And I'm gonna look at a couple of different wavelength ranges. I'm gonna look at ozone in the UV, and I'm gonna look at O2 in the optical and the near infrared. And I'm just gonna vary the amount of oxygen in this planetary atmosphere and ask how deep are the absorption signals relative to the sort of background. So these black lines here show the spectrum with no O2. So this is in the UV for this is a particularly prominent ozone feature. And for O2 here. So this is this black line here, this black line here are atmospheres where we've assumed there's no oxygen anywhere. And then we just sort of march through and say, all right, well, what if we have 0.1% of the present atmospheric level of oxygen? How does that look? What about 1%? What about 10%? What about a planet that kind of looks like the Earth? 100% PAL. And one of the things that jumps out from this almost immediately is that this O2 feature is not super sensitive. So you've got this is the 0.1% line, 1%, 10%, 100% is obviously pretty deep. But these are, you can see these in a perfect idealized simulation, but if you actually put these through like an instrument simulator, you would not be able to distinguish this from noise in most cases. Okay. But one of the things that you see is that for the same amount of oxygen, you get really deep ozone signatures, right? So for this O2 signature, that's almost certainly never going to be detectable in an actual observational case. You in many cases will see this level of oxygen quite well through ozone in the UV. Not always. This really, whether or not you're going to see this really depends on the instrument that you're using, the observation conditions. I don't want to be too glib about this here. But the depth of this at the same oxygen level is much stronger. And so we're starting to play around with what are the ranges of each of these signals relative to the amount of oxygen in an atmosphere, and we can start to say, all right, well, how does this look if you compare it to this sort of set of simulations? And again, the question we're trying to ask is, can we detect oxygen at atmospheric oxygen levels that are sort of out here so we can maintain this phosphorus cycle? Okay, that's sort of the key question. And it seems like if you are looking for ozone in the UV, the answer is yes. So ozone is sensitive enough that even at very low atmospheric oxygen levels, this is a world where you are easily supporting significant phosphorus release from oceanic crust. There's a very wide range here where you should, in most cases, be able to detect ozone in the UV. Now, in any given case, you need to sort of ground truth your particular body and observational conditions. Whereas with O2, it's going to be tough. So for most of the range of atmospheric oxygen levels that would be required to see O2 in the visible or the near infrared, you're going to ventilate the ocean. And so this whole system just kind of breaks down, and you're not going to be able to sort of keep the biosphere fed. So this is useful in a sense, and we came to this originally because there was some debate about the architecture of a particular telescope, and they were haggling over whether or not to have it only equipped for visible and near infrared, or whether to add mid infrared and UV. And we were saying, well, it depends on what you're looking for, but like if you're looking for oxygen-based biosignatures in water worlds, which is a good sort of well understood biosignature, you might want to have UV capability on this thing because it's going to give you a much wider range of conditions under which to look. All right. Don't go too long. Wrap it up here. So some takeaways. So we would argue that seafloor weathering under anoxic conditions, which is again, very different from what you tend to see on the modern Earth, can potentially be a really large source of bioavailable phosphorus. And you don't need anything boutiquey for this. You need mafic crust. You need water. And that's it. So, like rocky planets that have water on them are going to do this under the right conditions. And if their oceans are anoxic, then regardless of whether or not you have crust above sea level, you could support pretty beefy phosphorus fluxes and large oxygen fluxes as a result. However, there's a complication here because this dependence of the seafloor phosphorus flux on the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere through ocean ventilation produces a negative feedback mechanism that doesn't really operate. I mean, it kind of operates on Earth, but it's really the only game in town on a world with no crust above sea level. And so this is, now what we're sort of working on is kind of like, what are the dynamics of this feedback? When does it break? What's sort of long-term stability of it? This is not a feedback that people have really thought much about in the case of the Earth, and so it's a pretty open sandbox in some ways. So a lot to learn there. But it's so far, at least, it seems like there's a pretty large range over which you should be able to see atmospheric oxygen signatures at levels that are low enough to support this anoxic seafloor weathering. So threading this needle between low enough oxygen to feed a robust biosphere and high enough oxygen to detect might not actually be too small a needle. This might actually be something that's pretty common. So, obviously a lot of, we're just sort of starting to work on this. I'm interested in kind of feedback. One of the things that I sort of swept under the rug is that in all of those simulations, I'm varying oxygen and phosphorus independently and I'm fixing them. And so you might ask, well, what if I perturb this and let it run for a few million years? What's going to happen there? So this is something that we're playing around with now. It's a harder question to answer than you might think, but I'd be happy to talk about it. One of the other things is that was a very, notwithstanding the fact that I had no continents, that was a very earthy ocean, right? It's 3.5 kilometers deep, basically like a Proterozoic Earth climate. Oceans can get weird, much deeper oceans, very different salinities. How does ventilation work in, very deep hypersaline oceans, for instance? This is something else we're kind of playing around with. And how does that change the nature of this feedback? And when you get into really, really deep oceans, you start to maybe get the potential for forming high pressure ice layers at the interface between the ocean and the seafloor. And so, what does that do? And are there sort of remotely characterizable observations that would allow us to kind of avoid these systems if need be? Oh, that's it. All right. Surprise! Surprise! Sorry, I went a little long.
All right, thanks so much for this great talk. We're gonna open up questions. Please.
I'm just wondering about, so the assumptions on the amount of phosphorus present. So Earth needs phosphorus in all of our biology. Is there any sort of consideration for, are we unique in our solar system to have the amount of phosphorus that we do have? Is that an assumption we can make for other solar systems? Can we even see phosphorus there? Or can you just talk about those assumptions and kind of where things go if you really have to, take it down in order of magnitude, or where things might go if you took it up in order of magnitude?
Yeah. So in some ways, kind of like, what do I think about how does one orient themselves in these numbers? Like, what do these numbers mean? Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, there's a similar game going on for phosphorus as there is for oxygen in the sense that, so the way you asked it is sort of how rare in the solar system. I mean, even for the Earth, this is varied a lot. So throughout Earth's history, the amount of phosphorus that's in the ocean is very different from the modern ocean. And that's kind of what informs this bound here. And I think, how weird things can get on a water world, for instance, is, I would say, still kind of an open question. Because on Earth, we have some sense for the feedbacks that stabilize any particular value of phosphorus. And I say some, although this is a whole world of research, right? Like, we don't know everything there is to know about that. And we have some sort of empirical constraints on the amount of phosphorus in Earth's ocean over time. And so we can link that to tectonic processes and other, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere from other proxies and this kind of thing. So on Earth, it's varied, as much as, 2 orders of magnitude over time. So we know that you've broadened the aperture even further than that, but even just for the Earth, we're talking about a dynamic range of about 2 orders of magnitude. Now, that's for the most part appears to have been in the sort of negative direction in the sense that when it's very different from the modern Earth, it's less rather than more. But we're spending a lot of bandwidth now on oceans that have a lot more phosphorus, because the fact is, we're still sort of figuring out what the limits are on that end. And we don't have other than the Earth, there isn't a lot of empirical constraint you could place on it. I mean, even in the solar system, to first order, a lot of the, if you just like slapped an ocean on Mars, for instance, I think like a lot of the chemistry would probably be pretty similar in terms of the mineralogies that phosphorus is hosted in. And I, correct me if I'm wrong, actually, I know less about Mars than I do about Earth, but that's my instinct is that. And people have sort of played these games where you add some water to the Martian regolith and see what you get in terms of phosphorus concentration sort of locally. And my sense is that locally you can get pretty high phosphorus, but how that looks in a sort of global ocean is, I would say, still up for grabs.
As part of my question was more about like the development of the solar system itself and like the absolute elemental composition.
Yeah, okay.
Could there just be way less
Yes.
to work with?
Yeah. Yes. Yes is the short answer. Yeah. And yes. There's a whole there's an emerging literature on kind of looking at just the kind of inventory of stellar hosts to just sort of say like, all right, what are we working with here? Just like from a planetary inventory perspective. Because of course, this is all of this is happening at this very thin layer at the surface. Another thing I swept under the rug completely is like, where does phosphorus go when a planet differentiates? And that can look different depending on what you start with and the size of the planet and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's, again, it's how exactly how wide this range can be, I would say is still pretty up for grabs.
Question.
I'm curious, because in your diagram, when you do the loop of atmospheric oxygen, you're also looking at like there is an atmosphere. What about exoplanets like Enceladus that we think are subsurface oceans that don't have as much of that, maybe that water atmosphere interface?
Yeah, so icy bodies. Yeah, that's a can of worms. I mean, I think, I think sort of a lot of that seems to, and this is jump in for folks who do icy moon stuff. A lot of that is kind of like there's a whole universe embedded in this arrow here, which is kind of what you're getting at with that. So I mean, and this is gonna how thick is the ice shell? How is it being recycled and on what time scale? What oxidants are sort of being produced at the surface of it and mixed back into the ocean? It's as this is sort of not entirely relevant aside. Initially we started doing this to do icy moon stuff. That was actually kind of the original goal. And then we were like, this ice shell stuff seems pretty complicated. Let's just do it one more. But yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess the short answer would just be it's going to turn on the sort of strength of the connection of this arrow. And in some cases, I think if you sever this connection like aggressively enough with an ice shell, then the strength which you're going to have to tug on these to get a response over here is just going to be that much larger. And I mean, that's obviously very qualitative. I wouldn't hazard numbers. But yeah, there's absolutely a lot going on there. And the high pressure ice, I was thinking more about like this on the other end, but absolutely the case that you need to also be thinking about what's happening with this arrow. Yeah, it's a great question.
All right, for the interest of time, I'm just gonna have one more question.
Give it to us, Stephen, yeah.
All right, please.
Right. Considering the depth of the ocean as like a hyperparameter, do you think there's a sweet spot range in where we can find life? Like, I'll tell you what this question stems from. The movie Interstellar, like if you see the more ocean planet.
Just watch it at 70 millimeters of terror. Does it
stand on that planet, and they say there's no life. But Enceladus is pretty deep, it has a pretty deep ocean, and they're saying it has life. So is there a sweet spot range for depth of the ocean? Do you think?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I guess I would distinguish between the sweet spot for life and sweet spot for detectability, because they don't have to be the same thing. I tend to index more on not whether or not there's life, but whether or not there's enough action to get something to be remotely detect. And in that case, we're already finding that the depth of the ocean can be really important for that. Because it's just gonna, it's similar in some respects to your question. The depth of the ocean is also gonna really strongly influence the strength of this arrow right here. So I don't think I would hazard a guess on whether there's a sweet spot for depth as far as the presence of life, but in terms of the sort of abundance of it and our ability to remotely detect it, I mean, in the extreme case, I think once the ocean gets deep enough to form like ice-3 at the interface between the ocean crust and the ocean, I don't know. I mean, that seems tough to me. People are working, there are people, smarter people than I are sort of working on the sort of rheology of that system and whether you can get nutrients to go through it. But it seems hard. So I think like on that end, I think there probably is like a too deep. I haven't thought about the interstellar case too shallow. Yeah.
All right, thanks so much. We have a social events, starting 4 to 6 in the afternoon. We have one post in the location. Feel free to join, and thanks again. Thanks, Chris.
And I was looking, I walked. Like it's when I finally gave up. It's because I was like, it's fired down. And I was like, yes. Front end, he was like, that's downstairs.
Hey, oh yeah. First one,
I was so. Come upstairs. Oh yeah, you have two.
So much.
Before I got
Too
to the
kind.
office, I was so stressed. Like,
My pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. It's downstairs.
I'm into pain.
People, yeah, people look at it. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Shoot. I was.